Hello and good morning friends, welcome to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, we are pleased to announce that we have conducted numerous lectures under the series History of English Literature. Dear friends, this is the 17th lecture under the series and today we would be talking on the Victorian Temper. In first session, we would be discussing on the makers of the Victorian Temper, whereas in the second half we would be discussing on Arnold and Pater within the Victorian trajectory. And for this discussion we have once again within our studios Professor Bhim Singh Dahiya. Professor Bhim Singh Dahiya, as you know, is a renowned academician. He has spent his entire life in teaching and studying. His immense knowledge would be contributing and would making our lectures lively and productive. Dear friends, his teachings is followed worldwide. He is the author of the book A New History of English Literature. So dear friends, let's welcome our guest Professor Bhim Singh Dahiya, under whose able guidance we would be discussing in detail the Victorian Temper. Hello sir, welcome to the EduSet lecture.
Thank you. Well, in this lecture we shall try to explain, elaborate, elucidate the Victorian temper. Last time we talked about the spirit of the age. So it comes to about the same thing, the temper and the spirit, but then there is a difference of idiom and hence difference of level also, because the Romantics were high-toned, they were otherworldly, they were exclusive in their isolation. So that is why they used the word the spirit of the age. So they were not so much concerned with the matter as with the spirit, not with the externals of the age, as with the internal. As I said and keep saying, in literature as well as in life, there is reaction and action. So action and reaction equal and opposite, the same law as in physics. So here again, reaction against reaction against Romanticism was Victorianism. Well, Victorians were not known for extreme reactions. They wouldn't reject outright what their predecessors were doing. At the same time, they had a different line of approach. They had different ideas about life and literature, and therefore they brought about a sort of reconciliation between the opposites, between two very different things. Hence, it is popularly known as the Victorian Compromise. So, the temper of the age was compromising, not fighting, not rejecting, not violently taking its own course. So, it was a sober age in which different claims, different ideas, they got accommodated and coexisted, and the attempt was made to reconcile them. The extremes in this case were religion and science. You see, basically the Victorians were committed to religion as a reaction against the Romantics also, because Romantics were in a way anti-religion, and they went after their own dreams, aspirations, exploring the unknown, the new world. So, it was that kind of exploratory literature of the Romantic age. But the Victorian literature is more about reconciling the opposites, hence popularly known as the Victorian Compromise. So, when you think of the Victorians, the very first name comes to mind is of Thomas Carlyle. Thomas Carlyle was the most versatile among the Victorians. Born in 1795, lived a long life up to 1881, which means 86 years. So, during this long life, he wrote very many important books, essays, treatises. For example, the very first important book he did was Sartor Resartus, Sartor Resartus, Resartus, Sartus Resartus, 1833, where he says, I fancy there is in him, means man, the politician, the thinker, the legislator, the philosopher. He is all these. So, this is Carlyle's concept of man, because he does not want to have a two-dimensional image of man, that man can be either a politician or a philosopher. He can be either a businessman or a man of letters. He says no. Man has multi-dimensional personality, and therefore one can be many things at the same time. And the man he conceives of is a philosopher as well as a politician, a man of letters as well as a practical man, a domestic man. So, it is this picture of man that Carlyle draws in Sartor Resartus, 1833. Similarly, he wrote another very important book, The French Revolution, 1837. From the date we can see that it is a sort of belated response, because the French Revolution took place in 1789 and he is writing now in 1837. Those present at the time of the revolution, they were greatly excited by the event, and they thought this was the greatest thing happening in the history of humanity, because for the first time common people, everybody was going to have equal rights in all walks of life. This was unheard of, unimagined thing in the earlier ages. But now, after almost half a century, Carlyle thinks of writing about the event again. Obviously, he has something else in mind. He is not enthusiastic about the revolution. The Victorians were not. As I said, Victorians were for compromise, known for or notorious for compromise, and they were not for any drastic action. They were not for any extreme step. That is why the Victorians are known the conservative people, family people, domestic, and believing in the normal values of life and not to deviate into any kind of extremities, any kind of offbeat behavior in any walk of life. So that is why popularly Victorians are known for their compromise. But the greatest problem before them, where the compromise was called forth, was how to reconcile religion with science, because this was a very radical age of science. The most radical among them was Charles Darwin. And Darwin, we know, came out with his theory of evolution, debunking all that had been believed through the ages. Through the ages, what was believed was, according to Christianity, that God created man and woman. God created the universe for them. But Darwin said it is all bunkam. Man is not different from the other species. He is like any other animal and shares most of his habits with the animals. So, this evolutionary theory, in which he says man is just an improved species, improved upon other species. That is why stronger, superior, dominating, ruling the world. So, he associated with the animals the godlike man. Now, this was not palatable to people who were religiously inclined. They were up in arms against these scientists. They wanted to burn him, kill him for, you see, defying God, defying church, defying the sacred book, the Bible. So, all this raised a hue and cry among the people. But then these scientists were men of conviction, and they were ready to prove what they were saying, and they had a theory. They had studies which they had conducted for years together, and it is only after that that they had arrived at these conclusions. So, Charles Darwin, similarly Harvey, these people, they stood their ground and did not budge an inch. It is the men of religion who had to make compromise. Now, since times were changing, the temper of the age was taking a different hue altogether, and the greatest factor in bringing about this change was industrialization, because during the Victorian age industrialization was at its peak. We can recall how England at that time became the imperial force, ruling more than half the world, including India. And it was all because of its being an industrial power. It came to have industry like railway, even gunpowder, and such other things which empowered the British to rule other people. So, Victorian age in a way was the peak of the British power. Victoria, the Queen of the time, she was the most powerful ruler and ruled a long time, from 1837 to 1901, just like Queen Elizabeth. So, these two lady or women rulers in England, they ruled the longest time. This goes to their credit, and it was during their tenures, their regimes, that England achieved its glory. Glorious periods in history in all aspects, not merely industrial, in literature, in industry, in agriculture, in navigation, in all that. They were ahead of everyone else. So, Victorian temper was, even though seeking compromise, at the same time was not defeatist, was not without its aspirations. That is why the empire had its largest expansion during this period. So, despite the compromise, despite the limitations of temperament, they were not forbidden from their hidden aspirations. So, the writers of the age reflect that under the cover of compromise, they are trying to achieve something which they were aspiring for. They are achieving the goals of religion in some other name. Cardinal Newman, he was a cardinal, and Matthew Arnold, again a committed man of religion. So, both found the alternate ways, because directly it was not possible to sell religion because of too many scientific discoveries and people taking to sciences and walking away from religion. So, it was not possible to dissuade them or directly attacking science. So, very subtly, very cleverly, they tried to maintain the religious values and to sell them among people in the name of culture. That is why Matthew Arnold wrote that famous book, Culture and Anarchy, very famous, and he defines their culture. What is culture? He says, if a people, a country, a nation, a community does not have culture, then it will have chaos. It will be no better than the world of animals, and they will destroy each other. So, this was the idea of culture that Matthew Arnold and Newman, the idea of education. So, they sold it to the people. In Culture and Anarchy, Arnold is able to convince everybody that any nation which is without culture would not survive. It will perish sooner or later, because like the animals, people will eat up each other, destroy each other. And how does he define culture in that book? He says culture has two components, light and sweetness. These are metaphors or symbols for the qualities of temperament, your character. Light and sweetness. By light he means the enlightened mind, the open mind, the rational mind, the reasonable mind. So, mind which is not fanatical, mind which is not crazy after one thing and not accommodating anything else. So, that is the light or lightness as the quality of culture, that you are an enlightened mind. It is illuminated mind. It is not in darkness. You are living in the open air, lightened atmosphere, and you can see what is what. And therefore, you have the ability and strength to say what is what. Right is right, wrong is wrong. So, that is one aspect of culture, enlightened mind, not fanatical, not narrow-mindedness, that if you are a Christian, you are not open to listen to anyone else. So, this kind of openness was the enlightened mind of a cultured person. The second quality is sweetness. Sweetness, Arnold says, is a matter of conduct. How do you treat other people? How do you behave with other people? The other people may belong to any community, any caste, any religion, any nation. If you treat them decently as a human being, as a fellow humans, then you are a cultured person. If you don't do that, then you are lacking something. You cannot be called cultured. So, a great definition Matthew Arnold gave, that these two components, these two constituents are the high watermark or hallmark of one's evolution as a human. So, he didn't fight against Darwin. He, on the contrary, used his idea of evolution and applied it to culture. He said, yes, very well, he is not wrong. There is evolution, just as in animals, man evolved himself more than other animals and therefore is superior. Similarly, he says, those who have culture will outshine those who do not have. And there also it is a sort of evolution. If you are at the top, if you are ruling others, then you are superior to others, but superior not in military force, not in brute force, but in terms of your acquisition, in terms of education, in terms of culture, your values. So, this is what Matthew Arnold says in Culture and Anarchy. Similarly, Newman also wrote a similar book, but on education. So, there is a common ground, there is a meeting point between education and culture. After all, you cannot really separate the two. The two are so allied to each other. They have such a common ground that you cannot really separate them. And Newman, in his book, famous book, The Idea of a University, he for the first time defined what a university is. Before that, nobody had thought of university as an institution, and what should be the form or format or structure or constitution of the university. At random, we had schools of this philosophy or that philosophy, Buddhism or Hinduism or Christianity or Islam, and in their own ways they were spreading their messages, but there was no such thing as a university. So, Newman for the first time gave the idea of a university in mid 19th century, and he defined it. He said a university is open to all. It is a seat of learning, and no one learning will make a university. All learnings put together. That is why we have sciences, we have arts, we have other disciplines, management, etc., etc., applied sciences. So, all that is there, means it does not forbid the entry of any discipline. So, all disciplines of knowledge are welcome in a university. That is where I think we can stop. Great idea, which we are living even today, expanding it, improving it. Thank you. Well, to carry the story further, from Arnold, we come down in the later Victorian period to Pater, another important figure. So, if earlier years of the Victorian age were dominated by the idea of culture, the later Victorian period is dominated by the idea of arts, because in the earlier period art is not free from the entangles of other powerful institutions like religion. So, you had to compromise with religion, you had to sell religion, maybe in the name of culture, but you can't run away from it. You will not be allowed to practice unless you accept the authority of religion. So, during the age of Arnold, this was a given situation. Similarly, industry, science, these were dominant forces. They had also to be accepted, and hence the idea of compromise, as I said, came. But when you come down to the later years, the later Victorian period, then you find that there is a reaction against all this. And now the artists are insisting that art is for its own sake. Art is not there to serve the ends of other institutions. It is not there to sell religion. It is not there to sell culture. It is not there to sell politics or morals and manners, social values. So, it was an extreme reaction that art does not owe any responsibility except to itself. So, that is why the slogan that Pater raised was art for art's sake, not for the sake of anything else, art only for its own sake. So, it is inward looking, it does not accept anything extraneous. Hence, you seek excellence in style, in structure. That is why Pater and his contemporaries, they went back to the Renaissance. In fact, Pater wrote a book on the Renaissance, and he thought the revival of the Renaissance and even pre-Renaissance, medieval, they were the great painters of the Renaissance time all over Europe, which started in the 14th century Italy and spread to other countries including England. It were these great artists, he said, who should be our models, and therefore he not only wrote about the Renaissance painters, but promoted them, sold that art to his own people, and he was able to convince, yes, they were the great artists, they should be our models and they should be imitated. In between came other forces like industrialization, which were anti-arts, and therefore no compromise, it has to be rejected outright. So the elder Victorians like Tennyson, like Arnold, like Newman, they had tried to compromise, because they thought here is a force which cannot be wished away. The future belongs to industry, to technology. Therefore, it is better that it is accepted and a compromise, a deal is struck with it, so that a coexistence is possible between arts and sciences, between technology and fine arts. So Pater said, no, this will not do, and therefore rejecting science and industry and rejecting the compromise, he went back to the Renaissance, and he said that spirit of the Renaissance, that art of the Renaissance, particularly in painting, need to be revived, and he tried to revive it. But then one fundamental lack of understanding, which was there in Pater also, was that you cannot really bring back something which is gone. It is never possible. Time cannot be made to move backward. Time has to move forward. The only thing you can do is you can seek inspiration from the past. That, of course, is possible. So Pater sought inspiration from the Renaissance painters, but his attempt to revive could not have been a success. It was not possible. But then in his own paintings and in the paintings of his followers, his contemporaries, we can see the reflections of the excellence of the Renaissance arts that Pater did. So art for art's sake was the slogan of the later Victorians. They are called later Victorians or late Victorians, and you can see how different it becomes. But at the same time, the danger to such an art is that it cannot live for long. After all, can you separate arts from life? It may be literature, it may be painting, it may be music. The source of strength, the source of sustenance is life itself. If you cut it off from life and you think it will sustain itself, survive on its own, you are mistaken. And that's where Pater made a mistake, and hence the movement could not go long. It had to meet its end, and it did. Reactions came, and that's why it was soon taken over then by other movements. First, very small movements like imagism, like surrealism, aestheticism, so on and so forth. There were n number of little movements in arts. The very fact that it was such a large number of these movements shows the wide reaction there was to what Pater was trying to do, art for art's sake. So, all these movements showed it's not possible. Art has to have a link with life. It may be tangential, it may not be very strong and intimate, but then some source of sustenance. It has to come from life itself. It can't come from out of nothing. It can't come from the art itself. It can't be self-feeding, self-sustaining. So, that is where it ended, and it was replaced by the Modernist movement, which was actually not a movement by itself. It was only an assemblage of all these little movements. You put them together and we call them modernism. Actually, as such, there was no movement. It were only these little movements, as I said. Imagism was one, surrealism was another, vorticism still another, n number of things. Almost each one of them, it may be Ezra Pound, it may be other contemporaries of his, they had their own fancies, and they were coming out with the new ideas because the field was open. There was total blankness after you had done away with the tradition. That is why then Eliot came on the scene and he said, you cannot do away with the tradition, and you will have to have, for your own survival, in your own interest, a linkage with the tradition. You will have to become a part of the tradition, and therefore he gave this idea of tradition and advised the artists to work within the tradition. You can't survive on your own, and you have so much to learn from the tradition, which has come down from ancient times through the medieval ages, through the Renaissance, and then through the neoclassical period and the Romantic period, now to the Victorianism followed by modernism. So, that is how things moved in the later part of the Victorian period, and Pater, of course, was the central figure there, just as Arnold was central to the earlier phase of Victorianism. Here Pater became the central figure in the later Victorian period. But then art for the sake of religion, art for the sake of culture, art for the sake of education, all those extraneous concerns of arts were removed by Pater. He said, no, art is not subsidiary to anyone. Art is not a means. You cannot use it the way you like. as an instrument of advancing the interests of something else? Say no, art will advance only its own interests, not the interests of religion. You can't sell religion through arts, nor can you sell culture through it. Still further, you cannot sell education through it. So, it has to be free from all these, because these are extraneous concerns and these are external forces. They do not emanate from within the ambit of arts, they come from outside, and hence they are not acceptable within the framework or within the ethos of arts. It may be painting, it may be music, it may be poetry or drama, any other art for that matter. So, he gave an inclusive idea of art, and art for art's sake, art not for anything else's sake, however sacred that might be. It may be religion. It is not there available even in the service of God or church. So, it was a very bold step that Peter took, but he forgot one thing, as I said. You cannot survive in the vacuum. You cannot survive in colors only, colors of painting. After all, you have to have some linkage with life. Where would the sustenance come from? If you look back from the ancient times to the modern, you find that in every age, every phase of history, art had its feeding sources in life. So, there may be agriculture, there may be industry, there may be culture, there may be any other development which is always there in civilization, evolution. It never stops, life keeps going further and changing in the process, evolving itself for the better or worse, whatever, but it cannot be static. It has to keep evolving itself. So, Peter's problem was his inability to accept this fundamental fact, and hence his movement art for art's sake did not last very long. It had to end, and it ended. So, that is the story of the Victorian temper, how it began and how it ended, how it can be easily divided into two, the early phase and the later phase, the early Victorians and the later Victorians. Earlier ones committed to the idea of culture, religion, education, seeking extraneous services from arts, the later ones defying all this and denying all this and trying to maintain the sanctity, sacredness of the arts themselves. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us a very, very productive session once again. So, sir, what else are we going to study in the future sessions later on in the later stages? We believe that we would be talking on Victorian prose and Victorian.
Of course, no, Victorian poetry also, because this was general temper. So, the major poets, I think the next is Arnold and Tennyson, the poets, and then the prose writers. In fact, even drama they had, but not as important, but poetry and prose and criticism, because Arnold for the first time gave respectability and weightage to criticism, which it never had before. And Arnold is the first major critic, so to say. He gave those two series of essays in criticism, first in 1865 and then a few years later another. So, very significant contributions. So, all that we will be taking up next time.
Definitely in the future sessions we would be discussing on Victorian poets, we would be discussing poetry, definitely we would be discussing Victorian prose and Victorian criticism, as well said by Professor Bhim Singh Dahiya. So dear friends, we want you to give your feedback continuously so that we would be aware how much you are liking our lectures. If you want to give your feedback or any kind of suggestions or questions, then you can post us or you can mail us at info.cc@nic.in. Very soon this lecture is going to be uploaded on YouTube for you, and if you want to access the other lectures which we have already recorded, and these lectures are on YouTube for you concerning the series History of English Literature. So dear friends, we would be meeting again very soon. Till then, take care, goodbye, have a nice day. Thank you sir, thank you so very much.